Okay. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the long read, one of the popular columns of The Guardian. It comes out, I think, about twice or three times a week. I'm a very enthusiastic reader of that column. Although in the past few weeks I've been a bit put off by the length because it is long. But there was one long read that I finished from A to Z, that I read from A to Z, and it is the one that came out on July 18, and it was written by a British columnist, Nasrin Malik, of Sudanese origin. It's a very graphic account of the devastation that Sudan has been going through as a result of the conflict. It describes in very graphic detail the destruction, the dislocation, and arduous attempts to save lives by escaping from Khartoum. And as I read, I could not fail to recall the famous saying, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Is that going to be the future of some of us, you would say? Of course, that's been the fate of many countries in the past, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and so on. Total destruction of life and livelihoods and social fabric. So it's very apposite that we have turned our attention to discuss this very important issue. Sudan, of course, like the rest of Africa, has not been immune from conflict. It has had a long history of conflict from going back to 1955, the beginning of the Sudanese Civil War. And also it has, I think it has also more than its share of military rule. I was trying to make some calculation. In the past 7 decades after independence, I think there was only 1 decade. The total number of years of civilian rule comes to about 1 decade, about 10 years or 11 years. Otherwise, it was characterized by military rule of one type or another, Ibrahim Mahmoud, Nimeri, and the long-lasting Omar al-Bashir, and now also have the same problem. In spite of that, there have been some respites, short-lived they have been, the civilian rule after the fall of Ibrahim Mahmoud, and then again a short, about 4 or 5 years after the fall of Nimeri. The rather hybrid format, civilian military rule, which was probably doomed to failure from the very beginning, that we saw more recently. At the same time, in spite of this recurrence of military rule, Sudan has been characterized by a remarkable degree of civilian opposition. Civilian opposition. Students were the ones who brought down Ibrahim Mahmoud in 1964. And we have witnessed very recently the very vibrant civilian protest movement involving the youth and women in particular. But all this, of course, has not really helped much to solve Sudan's problems. I think to some extent the civilians are to blame because they have not been able to establish durable institutions of democratic governance, and hence the recurrence of this military rule. The 1921 coup opens a new chapter because that's really almost brought to an end this experiment, probably doomed experiment in civilian military hybrid rule. And that's probably opened the gateway to the current armed conflict. So it's, of course, I think our experts will tell us a lot. Of course, this is not a struggle just for power. It's also a struggle for resources. The difference from the earlier conflicts, which are confined outside the capital, the southern Sudan, Darfur, and so on, is that this one is centered on Khartoum. And the destruction is that much lethal and pronounced. The loss of lives, the destruction of property, the destruction of cultural heritage. As a historian, I feel very sensitive about this as well. The trauma of displacement, the many stories about how people try to escape from Khartoum across battle zones and then across the desert and under very, very difficult circumstances. And of course, more pertinent to our current situation, of course, is the lasting implications for the peace and stability of the Horn of Africa. It's because of all these considerations that GGA Eastern Africa has decided to organize this webinar, this timely webinar. It falls within its mandate of governance in Eastern Africa. Particular, of course, it is a branch of a continental organization which is based in South Africa. So we are trying our best to understand this. We have no illusions that it will bring about peace in the Sudan, this webinar, because, I mean, as we have seen, the parties have proven, the warring parties have proven particularly or singularly intractable to mediation. All the attempts so far have been futile. At the very least, we feel that we can help to understand the context of this devastating conflict. To that end, we have tried to marshal the expertise of both Sudanese and Ethiopian scholars to initiate this very important discussion. And our thanks go to them and also to the moderator for responding positively to our invitations. With that, I wish you all fruitful deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Bahru. We are very much grateful to our panelists. We have three distinguished speakers. Professor Manzoor Asal is Professor of Social Anthropology from the University of Khartoum. We have also Dr. Abdeta Diribsa, who is the Director of CDR, Center for Dialogue and Research. And we have Dr. Jacob Arsano, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Addis Ababa University. First, Professor Manzoor is going to give us his thoughts, but I'm going to have a very brief introduction of Professor Manzoor, and I'm going to introduce the other speakers before they take the floor. Professor Manzoor Asal, as I've said earlier, is Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Khartoum. He's also Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Bergen, Norway. He held several senior positions at the University of Khartoum. Among other things, he was Director of Scientific Research at the University of Khartoum. He was Director of the Mamouna Bahari Center for Economic and Social Studies. He was also Director of Peace Research in the Sudan, in Khartoum. So Professor Manzoor is going to share his thought, his insight with us regarding the root causes. What are the root causes and actors of the current conflict in the Sudan? And what is the current state of conditions and the roles of external actors in the conflict in the Sudan? Broadly, he's going to deal with these important questions. He's going to give us the background information, analysis, insight, and then the other speakers are going to follow up. Professor Manzoor, you have 15 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zarihun, and I'm very glad to see our old friend, Professor Bahru, with whom we had interactions in Austria and other forums. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm glad to be part of this timely and important webinar. I had like 4 slides. I'm not going to share the screen, just, I will just go through some of the points I did. And I hope I will be able to cover this in the 15 minutes that are allocated to me. I think much of the background information that I wanted to share with you has already been mentioned by Professor Bahru, who spoke about the short-lived democratic governments and long military dictatorships. We had short-lived democracies for a couple of years after our independence, from 1956 to 1958, and then we had the Abbot military coup from 58 until 64, and then we had another short-lived democratic government from 64 until 69, and then we had a very long 16 years dictatorship of Ja'far Numairi, and then we had another short short-lived democratic governments of Sadiq al-Mahdi from 1986 to 1989, and then we had the 30 years dictatorship of Bashir. So you can see that the country over the past 70 years had enjoyed very short periods of democratic governance and longer periods of military coup and dictatorships. And this situation made the military to be very central in Sudan's politics. Because if you add the total number of years that were ruled by the military, we have 4 years of Aboud, we actually 6 years of Aboud, and then we had 15 years of Numeri, that is 21, and then we had the 30 years of Bashir. So we are having like almost more than half of the period that followed independence was a military rule. And of course, the coup of Bashir in 1989 was the one that ushered most, if not all, the problems that we are currently suffering. This was because the coup was supported by a particular social group, that's the Islamists, who had a fully fledged program that they would like, or they wanted to implement in the country. But of course, even before the Islamists, Numeri also had some leanings in the beginning. Or at the beginning, he was leaning towards the socialist bloc, and then during his last days, he went back to the US and so forth. But the role of the Islamists is actually amplified and complicated the situation in the country, and one of the consequences of this is the war that we are seeing now. The role of the former regime started to crumble shortly after the secession of South Sudan in 2011, because the country was dependent mainly on oil. And when the secession took place, oil went south with South Sudan. And in 2013, we started to have serious problems in the economy, and the people took to the streets, but they were met with brutal force. Hundreds of people were killed and thousands were arrested. And then from there, things started to escalate. And the peak of this was December 2018, when people took to the streets. And it all started in some of the towns in the country, like Damazin in the Blue Nile and Al-Fashir in the western part of the country, and Adbara. And then Khartoum joined 2 weeks later. And the former regime was deposed on April 11th, 2019. What followed was a military council that was basically made up of the senior Bashir Security Committee. And there were some difficult negotiations between the military and civilians brokered by the IGAD and the African Union that resulted eventually in a shaky power sharing. And a civilian government was formed end of August 2019. The power sharing implied that the military would be part of the transition. And from the beginning, actually, the military had the upper hand, because the document that was signed left a lot of things very vague, unclear, and that gave the military the upper hand. They had the right to veto a lot of things, including the appointment of the ministers of Interior and Defense, who were, part of the quota of the military, and that gave them an upper hand in security matters and in all other things. That is not the only problem. The problem was, on the one hand, between the civilians and the military, because there is a lot of issues of trust. And the period from April 2019 until August 2019 was quite difficult. Although the former regime was deposed, the security forces continue killing people, and a brutal dispersal of the sit-in in front of the army headquarters resulted in killing of hundreds of people, and some of those who were killed had their bodies dumped in the night. It was horrible. And that created a big rift And the negotiations that were supposed to end in the power sharing were quite difficult, were not easy. But at the end of the day, that led to the Constitutional Declaration, which led to the formation of the transition government led by Premier Abdullah Hamdok. On the other hand, there were also problems and issues among the civilians themselves, because the forces for freedom and change were made up of political parties, trade unions, and all of that. And they also had different issues, starting right during they were negotiating with the military. They didn't agree on a lot of things, but they, went on with that Constitutional Declaration as a minimum basis for forming a civilian government, because people were sick and tired of what was going on. And they accepted that as something that could be the basis for a smooth transition. From the beginning, it was very clear that the military, given its past and its entrenching in the politics of the country, they were not really ready to relinquish power to the civilians, because the declaration that was signed in August 2019 made it clearly that the power sharing will be in such a way that the military will reign in the first 2 years. The transition was 4 years. So the first 2 years would be the military, and then the second, or the remaining part, would be for the civilians. And to the extent that the military was not really ready to have the civilians as leaders of the country, or a civilian head of state would replace the general from the army, they started making a lot of problems. They sabotaged the transition. They conspired to shut down the port in the country, in Port Sudan. And they literally suffocated the government of Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok. And things were moving from bad to worse until in October 2021, we had a military coup that basically dissolved the government, put the Prime Minister and his ministers in jail, and all of that. And although the PM was allowed to come back, he resigned after 2 months, because he realized that he cannot do anything, because the military was not really sincere in that deal, and the civilians continued to quarrel with each other. And there was very little that the Prime Minister could do. So we had the military coup that led to the complication of the situation, and the military leaders, I feel they didn't really thought, or they didn't think that they would be faced with a very formidable opposition from the youth, who took it to the streets almost every day. And from the day that the coup happened until the war of April 2023, I think more than 150 civilians were killed in the protests, and thousands were injured. Due to this, the military failed to form a government, and we haven't had a government actually for 2 years, almost from October 2021 until the war broke out. There was no government. There was a vacuum, and that actually impacted a lot of things. Now, what to do with the military coup? We had a lot of initiatives. Some of them are national, others are not. And we had the UNITAMS, that is United Nations Integrated Transition for supporting transition in Sudan, plus the IGAD and the African Union. They formed what was called the trilateral mechanism, and their main mandate was try to help in the situation and to put the transition back on track by shuffling between the military and the civilians, and among the civilians themselves, and all of that. What happened was that by the end of 2021, a political framework agreement was signed. We had a workshop which was organized by Sudanese Bar Association, and they provided a document that made it possible for the military and the civilians to sign what they call the political framework agreement. And that political framework agreement made it very clear that the military should go to its barracks, and that there would be a government which is fully led by civilians to lead the transition in 2 years, and after which there would be elections. This was December 2022. There were supposed to be a number of workshops that would debate the issues, and the outcome of those 5 workshops would be the basis for the final agreement that would be signed by by the military and civilians. Now, just quickly, the 5 issues were about dismantling the structures of former regime. The former regime has built a very big and corrupt economic structures through which they could dominate all things in the country. So that has to be dismantled. A workshop on Juba Peace Agreement, a workshop on transitional justice, a workshop on Eastern Sudan, because the East is also having a lot of problems. And the final one is on security sector reform. The 4 ones were organized and they went smoothly. They came out with a number of recommendations. And the last one on the security sector reform, that was quite problematic because the Sudanese armed forces objected to some of the things that were there. But the 2 critical issues that led to the war were the time that was needed to integrate the rapid support forces into the army. This is a paramilitary that was created by Bashir. And the second one relates to the chain of command. The rapid support forces insist that the integration could be done or should be done in 10 years, while the armed forces said no, it should be done in 2 years. And then when it comes to the command, the rapid support forces said that because they are a separate force from the Sudanese army, they should be attached to the civilian health state, while the Sudanese armed forces insisted that the rapid support forces should be under the Sudan armed forces. Now, these are the key things that sparked the disagreement. Mind you that the rapid support forces and the Sudan armed forces both have signed the political framework agreement, but when the time was very close to have a civilian government, this war broke. Now, there are a lot of narratives around here, and the most pertinent one was that the Islamists who were supporters of the former regime didn't want this deal to go forward, because if the deal goes, then they will be held accountable for the corruption that was done during Bashir's regime, and that was why they did all it takes to stop this. And actually, there were no secrets about this, because just 1 month or 2 months before the war, they were out there and saying that we are going to stop this by all means necessary, including going to war. And because the military coup itself was, to some people, was something that was organized by the supporters of the former regime, it was very clear that this was their thing. And actually, even now, those who are calling for the continuation of war were the supporters of the former regime, and some of them are actually actively fighting alongside the Sudan armed forces. So you had this. Now, moving quickly to the regional dimension, of course, there are also regional matters that need to be taken into consideration. The Sudan armed forces has historically been very close to Egypt. The rapid support forces, we all know that they were fighting with the Saudis and the UAE forces in Yemen. They were closely tied with the United Arab Emirates. Some report even say that the rapid support forces has big economic ventures in the UAE and all of that. And these are actually the 2, for me at least, the 2 critically important countries that are implicated in the current war: Egypt and United Arab Emirates. The Saudis were there, but their position is quite. It's not really very easy to point out whether they are, aligning themselves to either of these parties, especially now that they are leading the mediation with the Americans. South Sudan, well, this is another dimension, but South Sudan has its own problems. Ethiopia, of course, is also entangled in this, but not in a very direct way. Ethiopia has its own challenges and problems. Eritrea, and all of that, and Chad. And we see that now the neighboring countries are having some actions also trying to address the situation. Now, what has been done so far in terms of negotiations? Of course, I think most of you have been following what's happening in Jeddah. The US and the Saudis are trying to help these people arrive at the ceasefire. that is so far, not happening. The IGAD and the EU are also having some efforts. You must have been following what's happening. Just an ending note. I didn't want to talk about this because Professor Bahro has already mentioned it, that the humanitarian situation is quite serious. We had millions of people who were kicked out from their homes. Some of them are internally displaced. Some of them are refugees. Access to them is really not easy. There are a lot of bureaucratic restrictions and red tape. And I think something needs to be done urgently when it comes to the humanitarian situation, especially in Khartoum and in some parts of Darfur. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
I thank Professor Azal for his insight and the presentation. We now move on to Dr. Abdetta Dripsa. Before he starts his presentation, a very brief introduction about Dr. Abdetta. Dr. Abdetta has a very distinguished service at the Ministry of Ethiopia, the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry. He held several positions. He was Ethiopia's envoy to Somalia. He was also involved in IGAD-led mediation effort in South Sudan. What are the peace initiatives so far and why they failed to end the conflict in the Sudan? Dr. Abdetta is going to leave us after the presentation because he has an urgent meeting, but he's going to join us later on. Right after the end of his presentation, I'll accept 2-3 quick questions, but now he goes to the presentation. Dr. Abdetta, please, the floor is yours.
Professor Snack, and thank you for those who prepared this meeting for having me. Professor Manzoor Asal has said a lot about the various peace initiatives in Sudan. Several peace initiatives have been attempted to resolve the conflict in Sudan, but they have faced challenges and failed to bring a lasting end to the conflict. Some of the key peace initiatives before the current conflict have resulted in the signing of the framework political agreement, which was aimed at to address the crisis in Sudan by facilitating dialogue and reconciliation between warring parties. However, the sticking points between the military leaders, General Al-Burhan and General Hemeti, regarding the integration of RSF forces into the SAF and power dynamics hindered the implementation of the agreement. The disagreement over the commander structure and control of the military remained unresolved, preventing the successful execution of the framework political agreement provisions. And the other initiative after the war is, as you all know, was undertaken by the Saudis in collaboration with the Americans to resolve the crisis. Still, the initiative has not died, but it has not yet achieved its objectives. The third one is IGAD. IGAD had tried twice. First, by establishing a committee led by the South Sudanese president, in which Djibouti and Kenya were members. The committee achieved much. Eventually, IGAD summit in Djibouti, Ethiopia was asked to join in as a fourth member, and the chairmanship went to Kenya. Of course, immediately after that, there was a quartet meeting that was held in Addis Ababa. Although it has come up with a roadmap on the way forward, the absence of the Sudanese Armed Forces representatives that was officially invited as a government representative, their absence or their refusal to attend the meeting made the outcomes short of expectations. Of course, we should not forget the African Union also had tried in collaboration with IGAD previously before the current crisis in the realization of the framework agreement. Of course, why the crisis in Sudan, why the initiatives did not succeed as planned. I think a number of factors could be mentioned. One is that the crisis is so intractable. One has maybe has to go back to the leadership style of General al-Bashir, who had created various layers of security structures in the country, which made the conflict now ongoing in Sudan very intractable. Because General al-Bashir was afraid of coups, possible coups, he somehow, according to most researchers, has undermined SAF and created other layers of security structures, including the RSF. I still remember vividly when I was working at the foreign ministry, I had the privilege of engaging with the intelligence chief at that time, who told me there were almost 50 coups against al-Bashir that never succeeded to achieve their objectives, because the Sudanese armed forces were weakened in the Sudan. I think the other reason is the failure of the national dialogue in Sudan that played a significant role in contributing to the current military confrontation between the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF. The national dialogue was an attempt to bring together various political and societal actors in Sudan to address the country's challenges, including political, economic and social issues. However, the failure of the national dialogue exacerbated existing tensions, deepened mistrust, and created an environment conducive to the current conflict. In essence, the failure of the national dialogue deepened existing fault lines, exacerbated distrust, and created an environment where competing military factions, SAF and RSF in particular, found themselves on opposite side of the power struggle. I think the other very important point that one should not overlook is the role of external actors that has significantly complicated the war in Sudan, adding layers of complexity to the current conflict dynamics. These external actors include neighboring countries, regional organizations, international powers, and non-state actors. Their involvement can be both supportive and antagonistic, depending on their interests, alliances, and goals. Here are some ways in which external actors have contributed to the complexity of the war in Sudan. Professor, you will help me if I have gone over time. The first one is regional rivalries. Different external actors have varying interests, alliances in the region. Countries like Egypt and Ethiopia have their own long-standing disputes, such as on the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam, which spill over into the stance on the Sudanese conflict. This rivalry can exacerbate tensions and complicate efforts to find a peaceful solution. The other one is proxy support. External actors often provide support to different factions within the conflict. In my view, I think the parties in Sudan had the capacity to trigger the war, to start the war, but I'm not sure if they have the full capacity to stop the war in the Sudan because of proxy support to both sides. The parties that are supporting each side will ensure that the crisis either ends in a stalemate or in favor of their own. The other one is arms trafficking. External actors may contribute to the conflict by supplying arms to various parties. This influx of weapons can fuel violence, prolong hostilities, and make it harder to reach a ceasefire or settlement. The fourth one is differing agendas by external actors. External actors often pursue their own agendas in the region, which may not align with the best interest of the Sudanese people. Their involvement can complicate efforts to prioritize the needs of the population and find a peaceful resolution. While external actors can play a positive role for mediating and facilitating negotiations, their involvement can also create divisions if their efforts are perceived as biased or driven by their own interests. The other one is economic interests or external actors. External actors may have economic interests in the region, such as access to resources or investment opportunities. These economic motivations can influence their stance on the conflict and complicate efforts underlying issues. Humanitarian consequences, the involvement of external actors can impact the humanitarian situation on the ground. Military interventions or proxy support can lead to displacement, casualties, and other negative consequences. I think the other challenge is the role of external actors is the fragmented international response. The involvement of multiple external actors can lead to a fragmented international response to the conflict. Let me conclude by highlighting several factors that are attributed to the failure of these peace initiatives in the Sudan. The first one is lack of trust. The deep distrust between the military and civilian factions, as well as between the different factions within the military, has hampered negotiations and implementation of agreements. The other one is power struggle and complex historical context. The conflict in Sudan is fundamentally a struggle for power, with different factions seeking to maintain or gain control. The military's desire to retain influence and the civilians' aspiration for more democratic governance have created significant hurdles. Sudan's history of conflicts, ethnic divisions, and long-standing grievances requires a nuanced approach that takes into account the historical context and address root causes rather than just surface-level issues. The other one is fragmentation of armed groups. The presence of multiple armed groups and factions with different agendas and interests in various regions of Sudan makes it challenging to reach a comprehensive agreement that satisfies all parties. As you know, before the current conflict, there were several other armed groups that have not been accommodated within the context of the Sudanese state. The other one is external influence. The involvement of external actors, as I mentioned earlier, including Gulf countries with varying interests and agendas, has further complicated the peace process and contributing to competing initiatives. The other last one is lack of coordination. The lack of coordination between regional and international organizations, as well as the absence of a unified approach among key stakeholders, has led to fragmented efforts and lack of coherence. In conclusion, the failure of peace initiatives in Sudan stems from a combination of internal power struggles, lack of trust, fragmentation of armed groups, external influence, and the complexity of Sudan's historical context. To achieve a sustainable resolution to the conflict, efforts must address these underlying issues and foster a genuine and inclusive dialogue process that involves all relevant stakeholders. Thank you very much. I will email to Dr. Zarihun on the second aspect of my discussion in case I don't reach, so that he can present on my behalf later on the implication of the Sudanese crisis and possible scenarios that one could expect in developments in the Sudan. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdetta, for a very instructive presentation about the peace efforts. I thank him very much for his presentation. Good. Now we are going to proceed to the third presentation. The third presentation is going to be made by Dr. Jacob Arsano, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Addis Ababa University. Dr. Jacob Arsano has been following the Horn of Africa for a long time. He has published a number of works on the Horn of Africa and also the politics of the Nile, hydropolitics. He is also a member of the negotiating team, the Ethiopian negotiating team regarding GERD. He had several opportunities to travel to the Sudan and also meet with policymakers. I'm sure he's going to share with us very important insights about the implications of the Sudanese crisis to the Horn of Africa broadly, and of course to Ethiopia. Dr. Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really sorry for the mishap. It's due to technology and communication, and that is one of the problems, we have to resolve, in the meantime. So, esteemed colleagues have already spoken about the main topic, current Sudan conflict implications for peace and stability in the Horn of Africa. I think my title is the implications for peace and peace and stability in the region. I'm sure the first speaker has made a very good intervention on the background. Okay, let me do something. Try to make some statements. Yes, the Sudanese state is one of the oldest polities in the region. I think this has already been mentioned by the first speaker. And then Sudan was one of the highly civilized country already in the BCs, owner of the pyramids and related civilization in the northeastern Africa. So this is a great country, a great society, historically and culturally. Of course, Sudanese state problem did not start in the post-independence time. Sudan was overrun by the Egyptians already in the second last decade of the 19th century, which Sudanese, pushed back, and then the Anglo-Egyptian condominium set in, and that rule continued up to the independence of Sudan in 1956. So after 1956, of course, Sudanese state has been through several ups and downs. And these include the extended two-time civil war with the South, and alternated civilians and very effective mass movements in Sudan. Sometimes it managed to overthrow military regimes. The first one was in 1964, and similar the uprising which went off in 2017 resulted in the current military government. So uprisings in Sudanese society based on the middle class, students, professionals, and sometimes political parties together was well known. But now, I don't want to repeat perhaps what others said. The more important point at our time is the current crisis in Sudan. That crisis started, of course, with the overthrow of President Omar Bashir. Omar Bashir was overthrown in 2019 as the result of huge mass uprising in Khartoum and other cities. And then that was also more or less finally supported by the military officers who overthrew Bashir. But after overthrowing Bashir, strange kind of arrangement was created. Two generals, almost with equal power and power assumption or aspiration came to top power. And that was also rejected by the public. And the public forced the government to accept concession where civilian and military would rule together. And that resulted in establishing a civilian prime minister and the duo head of state, the military. That was a strange kind of arrangement, but it was a compromise. The military government overthrew the civilian government. The civilian government was totally discarded and alone, and with as much for the finally that not resulted, but that really developed into the inner fight in the palace, and the palace-based coup d'etat or attempted coup d'etat took place in this year in April, and the two generals took side. One on the part of the Sudanese Defense Force, and the other one was the rapid, the rapid security forces. And now that fight is going on, and the implication, all that we know, the implication is quite far-reaching. In the first place, in Sudan, the several dissensions, for example, in Darfur and the Blue Nile State, in Kordofan and in eastern part of Sudan, are still, going on, and the civilian opposition to the military is still going on. So the Sudanese situation, not only fighting between the two forces, but the rest of the society is really in a kind of unrest and in a kind of difficulty to look for internal solutions, and external forces tried their bit, as you might have been following. The first one was the Arab League. They tried their best in order to bring together the two parties, and especially to protect the civilians. And although there are agreements that did not work, and finally the IGAD, to which Sudan is a member, tried, with 4 East African representatives, Ethiopia, Kenya, Djibouti, and South Sudan. And they also recommended rapprochement and the solution, and that could not work. And finally, the neighbors of Sudan met in Cairo, and the result did not really make the two powers to budge, to accept negotiation and coming to a peaceful settlement between them, and security and calm down to Sudan. Now, internally, the Sudanese situation is really highly volatile. A lot of problems to be resolved. Some of them are long-standing. Others are maybe restarting, like in Darfur. And regionally, Sudan has a lot of really problems with neighboring countries. On highlight the question with Egypt, which is not settled, which needs a dialogue, and it takes a government, a calm government or collective government from Sudan to negotiate on behalf of the Sudanese government. So that gives a space for Egypt to continue on high level. And there is territorial issue between Ethiopia and Sudan also. The two parties always promise to discuss and to resolve the issue. But since the Sudanese government is not a good shape, and the Ethio-Sudanese territorial negotiations could not happen really. And then the long-standing Sudanese, Ethiopian cross-border negotiations on resource utilization, known as ESTAC, ESTAC Ethiopia Sudan Technical Council. It is not working, and Sudan is in the center of the Ethiopia-Egypt Sudan negotiation over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now Sudan is out. I mean, Sudan is not anymore giving priority to this format, although the negotiation was not, going as vigorously as it started earlier. But nevertheless, Sudanese situation now makes Sudan out of this negotiation, at least for some time. And the refugees fleeing in all directions from Sudan are now in the order of 1 million. And that makes the Sudanese and the regional, the result of Sudanese problem becoming a regional problem. And within Sudan, the displacement is so much internally dislocated populations. So all this together, I think this is articulated in the paper, of course, is very worrisome, and the implication is quite difficult for Sudan and also for the neighboring countries. Now, in lieu of conclusion or making a statement about this, the whole problem in Sudan is not a problem that erupted overnight. This is a problem which has been lingering from the time of independence, which did not have a real solution. Number of issues still pending and soaring. And now, at the moment, Sudanese problem should be and can be expected to be resolved by Sudan. Others can help, but in the name of helping, there may be many interests that would like to intervene in the Sudanese situation on one side or another. That might even further aggravate the situation in Sudan now and also in the future. So I think implications for peace and security arising from the Sudanese current crisis is both very costly for Sudan itself and very much disturbing and very much creating a lot of problems, worrisome in the entire region. So I'm really sorry for the lack of clarity of this presentation. Much of it is because of the technology. We'll improve technology in the future, I'm sure. I think what I should say in summary of the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you heard me.
Yes, indeed. At the beginning, there were difficulties, but you were loud and clear. Thank you so much, Dr. Yako, for your insightful presentation about the regional implications of the conflict in the Sudan. Now, I'm going to give each of the speakers 7 minutes, even less. They are going to address two things. One, first, they can respond to the presentation of the other. If there are pointers they like to reflect, very briefly, they could reflect. The second, the implications. Still, Dr. Yako discussed about the implication of the conflict to the Horn of Africa, but still, I think we do have room to discuss about the implications of the conflict to peace and security to the Horn of Africa. The third one is a very difficult exercise, scenarios. How this conflict is going to evolve, what scenarios the panelists see in the near future. We're involved with some colleagues in scenario building the last few months. It's not an easy exercise, but just to stimulate thinking and debate, I will ask the panelists to tell us how the situation in the Sudan is going to evolve. First, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Azad. Second, Dr. Abdata has already shared his notes with Dr. Zarihun. Dr. Zarihun is going to present on behalf of Dr. Abdata. And third, Dr. Yaqub is going to come back. First, Professor Azad.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zarihun. I think I will pick on...
I'm Asnaka, but nobody asked Zarihun, sorry.
All right, okay, thank you. I will pick up two issues. The first one is on the regional matters and initiatives, and the second one on scenarios. Now, as to the initiatives, I completely agree with the analysis of the presenter that there are a number of initiatives, you know, the African Union, the IGAD, the neighboring countries, the Saudis and the Americans in Jeddah. But none of these initiatives is making any strides or, you know, significant leaps ahead. And I think the key reason for this is the fragmentation of the international community when it comes to addressing the question of Sudan. We have actually seen this even during Bashir's period, that the international community has a lot of problems, a lot of issues. And for now, the international community sometimes complains about the fragmentation of the Sudanese civilian fronts as one of the challenges or problems that impede, you know, moving forward. I think to some extent that's true. But the irony is that the international community itself is fragmented, you see, and they need to put their act together first before asking the Sudanese to do that. And I think what we see in the Sudanese civilian front is normal, because these civilians belong to different political parties and they have their own orientations. So it's only logical that we shouldn't expect a complete unified front. Of course, there can always be some sort of a minimum ground or a bottom line over which everybody agrees, but still, this should not be something that impedes moving forward with I think the competing regional interests and of course visions and point of views is one of the critically important factors that impact on the war. Now, when it comes to scenarios, there is a fact that needs to be taken into consideration. Over the past 70 years, there wasn't a single war in Sudan which was won militarily by any of the fighting parties. All these wars ended through negotiations and agreements. Now, we may debate the tenacity of those agreements or you know, but the key fact that needs to be taken seriously is that this war is not going to be won either by SAF or the Arab support forces, militarily speaking. That's not going to happen. And the longer it continues, the more complicated it gets, and the more destruction it will lead to. And for this reason, I think, as a Sudanese, I feel that the chances for this war to be protracted and durable for a long time is highly unlikely, because already the belligerents are now coming to the conclusion that this is not going to be won, and this is one of the good things that might actually impact on their capacity to continue along with this side. But for them to come to terms with this and move forward in a positive way, so that they get into a long-term, credible and verifiable ceasefire, I think a lot of pressure is needed. And I feel that the Saudis and the Americans have the bigger chance because they have leverages. And to be very honest with you, I really don't see that IGAD or the EU have any leverage over these two fighting generals. Very little. But my last point here is that there is a need for a coherent and concerted international, mediation or initiative or whatever you call it. There needs to be a single platform, that brings together all these different things. If we are actually serious and sincere about ending the war, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Azal. Very interesting pointers. Practicing all the conflicts that emerged in Sudan in the last few decades were resolved by negotiation. I think it's optimistic. We now move on to Dr. Zarini.
Thank you, Dr. Asmata. I will not present Dr. Abdeta's paper. Rather, I will read since I'm getting it right few minutes ago. The implication of Sudan crisis on the peace and stability of Horn of Africa. He presented some 8 points. The first one is this regional spillover. Conflict and instability in Sudan can lead to a spillover of violence and insecurity across the borders. This can result in a displacement of refugees, the proliferation of arms, and the movement of armed groups, all of which can destabilize neighboring countries. This is the first. Second, in connected conflicts, the Horn of Africa is already grappled with multiple conflicts and tensions, including in countries like South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. The Sudanese crisis can exacerbate these existing conflicts and contribute to a major volatile regional environment. The third one is ethnic and tribal tensions. The Sudanese crisis involves ethnic and tribal dynamics that are not confined to national boundaries. Ethnic groups and communities are often spread across multiple countries in the region. Tensions within these groups in Sudan can reverberate in neighboring countries, potentially igniting or intensifying existing ethnic and tribal conflicts. The fourth point is a refugee crisis. If the crisis in Sudan escalates further, it could lead to a large-scale refugee influx into neighboring countries. This influx can strain resources, destabilize host communities, and create humanitarian challenges for countries already facing their own developmental and security issues. The fifth one is resource scarcity. The Horn of Africa is characterized by competition over water resources, particularly in the Nile River. The ongoing disputes between Sudan and Egypt over GERD can escalate into border regional water disputes, affecting multiple countries' access to water and potentially fueling conflicts. Sixth, economic impacts. Sudan serves as a transit route for trade and economic activities within the region. Disruption caused by the crisis, including borders closure or conflict-related insecurity, can disrupt regional trade and economic interactions, affecting neighboring countries' economies. 7, destabilizing influence. External actors with interests in the region can exploit the Sudanese crisis to pursue their own agendas, exacerbating regional tensions and rivalries. 18, peace mediation challenges. Efforts to mediate and resolve conflicts in the region are complicated by the interconnectedness of various conflicts, the involvement of multiple actors with varying interests and allegiance makes it challenging to coordinate and achieve consensus on peace initiatives. 9, diminishing regional cooperation. The Sudanese crisis can hinder regional cooperation initiatives and undermine efforts to address shared challenges such as poverty, infrastructure development, and security. Last, counterterrorism efforts. Instability in the Sudan can create a conducive environment for terrorist groups to operate and thrive. This poses a security threat not only to Sudan, but also to neighboring countries and the broader international community. These are the implication Dr. Abdeta sent me to read. I'm wondering if I have time to read the scenarios. He had something like 7 scenarios. Continued escalation. Stalemate is the second scenario possible. Fragmentation of control, the third possible scenario Dr. Abdeta is trying to explain. External mediation, regional and international actors may intensify their efforts to mediate the conflict between RSF and SAF. Diplomatic initiative could lead to ceasefire and temporary halt in hostilities, allowing for negotiation to take place. The fifth is shift in alliance. The conflict dynamics could shift due to changes in alliance and the emergence of new actors. If some factions within RSF and SAF changes their allegiance, or if external actors withdraw support, it could impact the overall balance of power on the ground. Sixth is humanitarian crisis. Regardless of the military outcome, the ongoing conflict could lead to deepening humanitarian crisis with widespread displacement, food shortage, and a lack of access to basic services. And last, peace agreements, which all of us pray to come. There is also a possibility that the RSF and SAF could agree a negotiated settlement to end the conflict. A peace agreement could outline a power-sharing arrangement, security sector reform, and roadmap for political transition. However, reaching such an agreement would require overcoming significant hurdles, including addressing the root cause of the conflict and addressing the interests of both parties. These are the scenarios Dr. Abdeta wrote. They are really detailed, and maybe the 7 minutes are not enough to read all in details. Thank you, Dr. Asnaga.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Zariun, for the presentation, for reading Dr. Abdeta's part. We now move on to Dr. Jacob. Dr. Jacob has already made a presentation about the regional implications. If there are still some points he likes to mention, we will have the time, and also the scenarios. Dr. Jacob, are you with us?
Might create a state crisis with a number of interdissensions which are historically lingering and which have not been resolved. The state central power. So I think that is one implication. It is an implication, but one cannot count out that state crisis might come in. And state crisis usually attracts external intervention. From the experiences of many countries in Africa and elsewhere, the UN is the first to come to intervene in order to put things, and to help the local forces out their problems and the country from external, forceful interventions of countries or countries away. So that in quite late if this problem is not solved. And this crisis creeps in. So these are the 2 implications as I see from where we stand now. In terms of I think this can be, so one scenario is that the civil other military force, the 2 generals can come and overthrow them, and then establish more progressive. I mean, it's sometimes difficult when and where military is progressive, but in any case, when we look at military in terms of state interest, in terms of peace and security, in terms of outside intervention, and also that more progressive military can come and take over the power, and maybe level situations for life in Sudan, maybe giving more space for the civilians and accommodate the demands from the public, and attempt to resolve internal Sudanese problems in the regions, and may facilitate negotiation internally and keep Sudan at least a meaningful state with meaningful governance. That does not mean democratic governance, but a governance that really looks after the immediate Sudan public and the Sudanese state. I mean, this could be some of the scenarios. These are wish lists. They may not be clear, but that is the possibilities, I think. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now invite our audience to pose questions to the two speakers, Professor Azal and Dr. Yaqub. You can raise your hands. Yes, Dr. Zarif Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and I would like to thank both presenters for the nice presentation, and it clearly shows the intensity and magnitude of the problem in the Sudan. My question is on the scenarios. On the one I read from Dr. Abdata, the last one is really very appealing, a peace scenario. But at the end of the day, the Sudanese people and also the people in the Horn of Africa needs peace in this area. In that case, my question to both presenters, how can the two warring parties can accommodate their now highly polarized interests, political interests? What are the possibilities to bring them to a common interest? Is there any way to do that with the existing situation? Otherwise, what will be the other options to force them to come to the negotiation table and make a compromise on their interests? Thank you very much.
Okay, let's collect a few questions and then we'll go to the presenters to respond. Prof. Baharu.
Professor Hassel, welcome back to Ethiopia, and nice to see you again. What is the position of Darfur in all this? Well, has the problem of Darfur been solved once and for all, or are they going to impact? I mean, is the conflict going to impact also the situation in Darfur?
Thank you, Prof. Baharu. Ato Kuberlacho.
Yes, thank you. My question is to Professor Raza. It's a very interesting and insightful presentation you made. Now, I think you said that from its presentation, what I was able to understand is right now both parties have realized that neither one can win this war, and hence there seems to be an opportune moment to push them to negotiation or mediation. And it seems to me that the US and Saudi have a better leverage in this regard. So, what, Professor Azar, what's your proposal regarding the African Union and IGAD? What should they do at this point in time? Should they work with the US and Saudi so that this part should have the lead in the negotiation process? Or because otherwise, what we're having seems to be what you call form shopping, duplication of efforts in this regard. So, what do you recommend in this regard? My second question is, we hear that there are lots of human rights violations being committed in this war, especially by RSF forces, including gender-based violence and sexual slavery and what have you. what will be the role of civil society and international actors in terms of ensuring accountability, and how would issues of accountability feature, vis-a-vis dispute settlement or mediation to bring about peace? Because in many instances there is tension between and peacemaking. Thank you.
Let us give the chance to Professor Azal to respond to the questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions and comments. I think I had 3 ones. How can the warring parties accommodate their bitter differences? I think this is a very important and critical question. And yes, it is one of the difficult things because this is now becoming like a dogfight between the 2 generals. They, they exchange it invective and bad words and all of that. But this is not something about personal matters. This is a matter of a country falling apart. So they will have to swallow whatever bad things they have been saying about each other, and they have to sit down to solve this problem. Because at the end of the day, I don't see any other way out except through negotiations. Professor Bahru, I think this is a good question about Darfur. Darfur is part of this conflict, and as a matter of fact, Khartoum and Darfur are actually the sites of the current war, especially Western Darfur state that witnessed terrible crimes that can be seen or considered crimes against humanity. The Darfur question becomes more complex if we take into consideration the fact that there are armed movements who signed the Juba peace agreement and who so far, are very neutral, and they made it very clear that they are not going to side with any of the warring parties. And to me, this is a very good position because otherwise it could lead to more escalation. And will, pit the society in Darfur apart, which is already being polarized over the past 20 years. I think also local groups in Darfur succeeded in some of the states to calm down the situation, like in Eastern Darfur state. So far, not a single bullet was fired by the Rapid Support Forces or the Sudan Armed Forces. North and South Darfur remain to be volatile, but still also the situation is calm. The challenge is in West Darfur and Central Darfur. West Darfur has witnessed, as I said, crimes, and as we speak, there is fighting between SAF and Rapid Support Forces in Central Darfur state, each one claiming to dominate the state. We don't know what's going on. But the whole situation, if you take it in totality in Darfur, is quite fragile, and I think everybody should be attentive to that. Kumlashio, he said that what would be my advice to the AU and African Union? Well, as we speak, there seems to be some sort of undeclared division of labor, because the Americans and the Saudis are focusing on ceasefire. They are trying to bring these 2 fighting armies to sign a peace agreement. And then the AU and the IGAD are focusing more on the political processes. I already hear that they were initially thinking of having a meeting for the civilians on the 25th of this month, but this is too close. I now hear reports that they are postponing this to the first week of September, whereby they are trying to bring all the civilians together in a hope that they would come together and have the possibility to formulate a position vis-a-vis what's going on. And then your question about the crimes. Of course, the Rapid Support Forces committed a lot of crimes in the capital, not the least, kicking out people from their homes, looting, ransacking, stealing things. Even if they didn't do that, it is the responsibility, because they are de facto control of the capital anyway. They brag about the fact that they are controlling like 80% of Khartoum. So if you are controlling the area, you should be held responsible for whatever happens there. But the Sudan Armed Forces also should be held accountable because they shell residential areas, they use Air Force to bomb, and actually thousands of homes have been destroyed by the air bombardments. So the responsibility is actually shared between the warring parties and the civil society, and the circumstances trying to do its best to engage in some humanitarian work by trying to get food and medical supplies to people in the national capital and in other areas that were affected by war. But of course, the humanitarian access has been a very big challenge for everybody, for the international community and for the local actors that are trying to do something or to help people who are in need. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Azal. There is one from the chat. There are comments for everyone, but there is one specific question to Professor Azal about the impact of the conflict on the national dialogue process.
Yeah. Yes. The political framework agreement, which was signed in December 2022, was a chance for the country to get back to the track of transition, even if it wasn't successful in galvanizing support of everybody or making everyone signing to it. But still, it was something. It could have averted this devastating war that we are witnessing now. And I think, given the war, there is no way that there will be any form of sensible dialogue before a ceasefire is established. This is the first step. And then what the IGAT and the AU are doing, goes into the direction of bringing the Sudanese together, the different, groups, voices, civil society, political parties, to start a process that is supposed to be inclusive, so that they will come out with a unified vision of what they want the country to look like after a ceasefire is being established.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Azal. I think there are no more questions. It was a very interesting afternoon, and yes, before we go to the end of ending the discussion, let me also invite Dr. Yako, if he's going to respond to some of the questions.
I see none of the questions are directed
to you, I know, yes, but still, if there are...
to me, but I think to be perhaps wishful, and with the experience of Sudanese political, with the experience of Sudanese political movements, I think no. You can't hear, eh?
No, we are hearing.
Okay. Not just to be wishful, but I think with the experience of Sudanese civilian movement, which is a broad-based one, I'm sure they have suffered quite a lot under President Bashir, as well as under the military council, the National Military Council. But I think still there are situations, and there are hopes and experiences, and there are also important interest among the civilians within Sudan itself and outside Sudan with a lot of ideas of how to galvanize the civilian coming back as a movement, as a force to make a point, to tell the military that they can not anymore continue in the first place fighting among themselves and ruling over Sudan for a longer time. I think that is one hope, and I think that's a possibility. It's not something we can just get it right away because of the fatigue and so on. I think that is one hope. You know, how we see Sudan, to fare in Sudan's policy to fare in the future. But my fear is that, if this fighting continues and if this fighting keeps Sudan producing so many refugees, producing, so many, fatalities, especially of civilians, producing so many displacements and economic destabilization. Sudan might, creep into the crisis of state, which, God forbid, may encourage external forces to come to Sudan and to be, the master of, situations in Sudan. Before that happens, a number of other scenarios can happen, thrown by another military. That's a possibility, or one of these forces can, relinquish, their position. I'm not sure ceasefire can come so quickly. It would be so important. External support from the Arab League, USA, from AU, and the quartet in the IGAD, all tried, to facilitate this, but this is not happening. But the two guys are out, determined to do away with the other party. So I think the problem is quite deep. I hope the civilians can rebound, in a time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yacob. We have a very interesting discussion this afternoon. I'm not going to summarize what was said by the three panelists, but raise a few outstanding points, which in my view are very important. Professor Azad raised two major points. The first, in my view, is the presence of layers of security by the al-Bashir regime, how it successfully helped to stem whatever coup attempts against the president, but how these security structures became sources of violence or helped the conflict to be intractable. This was a very interesting point. The other point, which is also very important to us, Professor Azal said the Saudi and the US are the powers who do have the leverage on the two fighting forces to bring peace in the Sudan. I think this is a very good statement, a very important insight, because the African Union has been building the security architecture. A lot of investment was made on African solutions to African problems. But as we see today, even in Niger, after the coup d'etat, there is this division within the ECOWAS. And also, I think one important point which was not raised probably in the presentations, the presence of a multipolar international system, the presence of Russia, the presence of China. All these powers make resolutions of conflict is very difficult. This would take us to the point one of the points is that Dr. Abdetta raised. He said, you can start a war, but may not be able to end that war. I think this is a very sobering and a very important insight, not only to the Sudan, to many African countries. Why it's difficult to end a conflict, a war, because of the involvement of several actors, which Professor Azal, Dr. Jacob raised. Dr. Jacob also raised very interesting points. I picked two of them. One is state crisis. As far as there is a state crisis, inability by the state actors to contain conflict crises, they are going to invite foreign actors. The foreign actors are going to have their own interests, their own stakes. The involvement of very many actors make a resolution of conflicts difficult. Dr. Jacob also raised one point, very important point, the role of the civil society. The civil society played an important role to bring down the al-Bashir authoritarian regime, but still the civil society might, he said, rebound and help to bring sustainable peace to the Sudan. With this, I end my intervention. Before I end this session, this panel discussion, I would like to thank again the speakers, the three speakers. We have also a large audience. I also thank our audience for your patience, staying throughout the discussion, and also thank Good Governance Eastern Africa for organizing this very important event, Dr. Zayoub Mohammed and Bethlehem for organizing the event. Now I end the session. Thank you so much. See you.